As you know, we've all become way too aware of the countries within the country that are the states as a result, of course, pandemic closures, border closures, all the rest of it. But there is a story behind why the map looks like the way that it does. And the man who is put together an excellent documentary about how the states became the way that they did, are the way that they are, and why there are straight lines and squiggly lines is none other than the great Ray Martin, who's got a show about this coming up this weekend here on Sky News.
Hi, mate.
Legend, lovely to see you.
Great, Paul. Good to see you too, mate.
So, again, we can all remember that geography class where, New South Wales used to be all of Queensland as well,
Yep.
and then someone draws a line. But when you set out on this journey, what was it that motivated you to say, you know what, I want to go a little deeper and remind people a little more than just the map they had to remember in school?
It was COVID, as you said. I mean, we thought we were a nation, a federation, and suddenly we were 7 or 6 different countries. And WA put the border up and Queensland did, and so on and so on. So someone just said, look, why don't we go back and see how it all started? And again, I was going to be a history teacher, and so I thought I read all this stuff, and I thought, good, but, boring lawyers and surveyors. Wrong. Amazing human stories about, where half the country was divided by the Pope back in 1494, that sort of stuff. And then from there, Flinders and Cook and so on, and then, and lawyers and horse traders and was gold discovered in Victoria before they became independent? And it seems it was. All these sorts of things. It was almost state of origin back in the 1800s.
But also sort of a perfect story of what doesn't make sense about the way that we drew state borders would, say, be the New South Wales-Victoria border, where the Murray River is the squiggle, and then it turns into a straight line, and then we've got a straight line down to South Australia. Those sorts of things. Why do you think they didn't make decisions based off rivers and off more natural breaks
as blackfellas, as Aborigines did?
Yeah, correct.
Traditionally, that's what they did. That mountain over there is the end of my country, and that's your country.
Well, and when you have a look at the map of all the different Indigenous nations.
Yep.
It's all no straight lines,
yep.
Right?
And worse than, as we make the point, much heavier than customs houses. You walk over my country when I'm a blackfella and you live in that country, I'm probably going to kill you without your permission. I won't just fine you. I'm going to throw a spear at you. Was that sort
Don't tell Mark McGowan about that.
That's right. It was that sort of critical. But you would have thought, let's say the Murray, that we'll just follow the Murray down. But Victoria would have been much smaller had it gone to, like on the South Australian side. So they wanted a bit of the other side of the Murray.
Yeah.
And of course, naturally, I think what sensible people would have done was simply say the Murray's the dividing line. Even with the Murray, New South Wales, because it's more powerful back in the 1850s, before gold, they pinched the Murray, so it's only the southern side of the Murray that Victoria owns. It's the high water mark on the Murray. The Murray itself is owned by New South Wales.
Yeah.
Until you get to South Australia. Yeah. That sort of thing. So it's just extraordinary. And they went through, and when you think that amongst our greatest explorers were these surveyors who went out in the 1860s with camels and blackfellas leading the way for them and basically providing them with food. And they'd go with camels and enough equipment for 3 months, and they'd drag that chain, a chain the length of a cricket pitch, which was a chain, and they'd drag along to make sure that this was where the border was meant to be, not where you are.
But also, it feels like, great detail in the way New South Wales looks, and then Victoria, Queensland, okay, and then it feels like we do get lazy, that there's just boxes for the rest of the country. In your studies, were you able to work out why, essentially, they just went Western Australia? That's it. It didn't become multiple things inside.
No, it's almost Whitehall deciding about a country they'd never even seen. They knew what the East Coast was like, and they knew what Tassie was like, Van Diemen's Land, but they had no idea what they hoped there was an inland river, an inland sea that they could actually go in and cultivate and use, but they didn't know. So, Cook. The rule amongst explorers early days was that you could only claim what you'd seen. So they go back to the old map, which was roughly correct, the Dutch had drawn, and they divide it down the middle where the Pope had divided it, and back saying, on the left, if my foot's on the western side, we'll call that New Holland, and we'll give that to the Dutch, and then we'll call the rest the colony of New South Wales. Right. They had no idea what was there, but in Whitehall they said, that's a good idea, and we do that. And then 29 years later, they're worried about the French on the west coast, so they say, Fremantle comes from South Australia, plants the flag in Fremantle and says, right, bugger off, this is now also British land. So they just own it.
But also, it's, I'm a great believer in national identity, so I'm obviously very passionate about being an Australian, but I'm not particularly passionate about the state from which I'm from, but maybe that's just because I was born and raised in New South Wales.
I think that's it. I'm the same, but in the documentary, Daniel Andrews' wife is an historian and very knowledgeable on this. She sees herself first as a Victorian and then an Australian. And I'm the same as you. I see myself first as an Australian, but I'm Queenslanders. I think they probably see themselves first as Queenslanders. And West Australia, of course, always thought they were an independent country, so who cares?
So again, while, completely accidental, it sort of says something about national character, that as you were talking about with the Indigenous people and how their map would have looked, the idea that even during that COVID period that people became, in my view, a little bit irrational about the evil people over east or the evil people from the diseased people of Victoria, that there's something about these arbitrary lines that we think give us sort of a superpower, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the Indigenous Australians. What's interesting out of that and what we discovered in doing the trip around, the penny finally dropped for me after having looked at this stuff for many, many years in terms of reconciliation. But the big difference that we have with those borders, it wasn't the prospect that you came into my country and you're a different blackfella to me. It wasn't just that you might get speared, almost certainly you would, because you're only coming to my country either to kill or to take our women and our children. Yeah. And therefore, if you came over without permission, you're a bad guy. What the Aborigines did when we discovered from these borders is that, in this border story, is that when I went to your country to war, and they were quite violent, very violent, not passive, I would kill as many of the men as I could, and I would take women, and I would take children, and I'd take spears and canoes and all those other things, but I'd go back to my country. Unlike the Europeans or even the Maoris who take the land, I would never take your land. There were borders here before we came.
Oh, 100%. 100%. But also very important to say that about that idea of you might take the stuff, but you don't redraw the map, was a very different way of doing things.
Whereas the Germans, the Brits and the French and the Spanish all did that.
Exactly. Last one here. I know you're an avid photographer. You put out books about your photography. Was there one place while you were making this you were able to get a particularly good snap?
There's a place outside of Cooper Pedy. If people go out to film Lake Eyre, and you've almost got to do it from the air, just north of Cooper Pedy on the way to Alice Springs is a place called the Breakaways. And it's about 7 k's off the main road, the Sturt Highway, and it doesn't really say, hey, this is one of the great places of the world if you want to take photographs. And we sort of stumped, the locals said, oh, you should go and look at the Breakaways. We got up there and I've, like you, I've seen most corners of this country. Yeah. This blew me away. This was just, we were there for the sunset and this red sky came in and then it went pink and then it went yellow. No one had ever told me about the Breakaways. The Breakaways are, I reckon, more impressive than Uluru and the Bungle Bungle. It's just amazing.
Well, we look forward to seeing those photos whenever the next book comes out. Your passion for the country is infectious. The documentary is fantastic. Ray, thank you very much.
Thanks, mate. Great to talk as always.
Thank you.